At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
The field of mental health counseling is growing rapidly, and Richmont Graduate University can equip you with everything you need as a licensed professional counselor while integrating your faith into your clinical practice. Programs are offered in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and online. Apply today at richmont.edu. That's RICHMONT.edu.
I've never had a constituent come to me and say, Scott, you know what? I've got too many choices in education. I wish you'd please pare them back.
Georgia Republicans passed public subsidies for private school tuition by the slimmest of margins.
And a last-minute move to ban puberty blockers blindsides Democrats.
The only people that we've heard from today are the people who clearly knew that the sub was coming and support it.
And efforts to expand gambling in Georgia come down to the wire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Grateful to bring Senate Bill 386 before you. It's sports betting legislation.
On today's show, we'll talk about all things schools with WABE education reporter Juma Say.
I'm WABE politics reporter Raul Bally.
And I'm politics reporter Sam Greenglass. It's week 10 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Gold Dome Scramble, a podcast about the legislature and more from WABE News in Atlanta.
So, Raul, I spent my Saturday with President Biden and former President Trump in my ears with split-screen rallies here in Georgia before the primary. Both of them flew into our state. But I understand that you spent a day on a different presidential plane. It was neither of theirs?
That's right, Sam. You know, my sister lives up in Ohio, and I spent last weekend hanging out with her. And by the way, thank you for picking up the slack while I was gone. And we made a little side trip to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, and that's over near Dayton. And first of all, it's an amazing place to visit if you're into planes or into history. But they have a section called the Presidential Gallery, where you can see, dating back to what really was the first Air Force One that FDR used. You can see the one used by President Eisenhower, and then the Air Force One that lasted from President Kennedy all the way to President Clinton. And let me tell you what the most, like, you have one of those incredible moments. I think most of our audience knows that image from 1963 when John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas and Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as president on Air Force One. That image, you can stand in that exact spot where Johnson became president, and you realize that you're around history. So very, very cool to check that out. And if you're ever up in Ohio, I think I'd suggest you guys, anybody go there.
Though I will say Ohio is the worst state in the union, but that is neither here nor there. All right. I don't want to dwell on the primary too long, but let's stick with presidents just for a moment, because of course it was the Georgia primary last week. It was a bit anticlimactic, but both Biden and Trump did clinch their nominations on Tuesday night. And instead of rehashing too much, I just want to ask you for maybe that one nugget from Tuesday's election that is helping shape your understanding of what lies ahead during the rest of the 2024 election.
So there was actually another election that happened on the same day. It was a special election runoff out in the Augusta area. And that's because State Representative Barry Fleming, a Republican, had resigned so he could become a Superior Court judge in Columbia County. So there was a special election. Nobody got 50% in the special election, so it had to go to runoff. The runoff involved two interesting candidates. One, a former county commissioner who, is kind of cut out of the mold of Brian Kemp and that part of the party, versus C.J. Pearson, who's a social media influencer and absolutely Trump-aligned. He was even at that rally in Rome that former President Trump held. And so an interesting race. Governor Kemp got involved with that race, endorsed. Gary Richardson ended up winning. But again, you're watching this question of, so what happens this November, the combination of those kind of in that Kemp moderate wing of the party and even conservative wing of the party, along with those who are on the Trump side of the ledger. And one other interesting thing I want to mention, another dynamic, there were some calls for a hand count of the ballots because there were some issues with the poll pads. And, you know, you've started seeing on social media people going down that, you know, some of those conspiracy theories we've seen before about Dominion machines and how voting and elections are handled in Georgia. And it's just a reminder that we may be seeing some of those dynamics and those lines being used this coming fall.
So here's the thing that I'm going to be watching going forward. Nikki Haley got about 78,000 votes in Georgia. And yes, many of these were cast during the 3 weeks of early voting when Haley was actually still in the race. But many of these votes, they were concentrated in Metro Atlanta. Of those voters who are not Democrats, my question is, do they fall in line for Trump this fall? Do they vote for Biden? Or do they just straight up stay home? On the flip side, I want to play you a cut from a woman I met at the Biden rally. Sine Carpin told me she's just starting to tune into the election and hasn't made up her mind yet.
You know, it's hard to see a future when you are flooded in debt and you can't find a place to live. Then there's wars in other countries, and then groceries go up and like all these different things.
Carpin says she's not sure if an 81-year-old politician really gets what life is like for a 27-year-old like her. What Georgians like Carpin do this fall will be very important as well.
So those are our quick thoughts on this week's voting. So let's transition back to the Capitol, but stay on Election Day. Governor Kemp called a last-minute press conference. And, you know, Sam, you went to that and actually you texted me saying, you know, it was a pretty newsy press conference. First of all, he declined to say who he voted for in the primary. And when you asked whether he'd campaigned for the former president, he instead kind of focused on maintaining the GOP majorities in the legislature. And he also took questions on a bunch of other topics.
Yeah, so before we get to those other topics, I just want to dwell on the election for one more moment. And Raul, this was interesting to me because at first it sounded like Kemp was saying that he voted for Trump in the primary, but his staff called and clarified that he wasn't meaning to imply who he voted for at all. And I followed up to say, so who did he vote for? And they declined to say. We know Kemp has said he'll support the nominee because it'll be better than Biden. But to me, it's very interesting that Kemp is still trying to thread a very careful needle here, not being willing to say who he voted for in the primary, but still being clear that come November, at this point, he will support former President Trump in the matchup against Joe Biden. Now, I want to turn to some other topics here. We're going to hear from Governor Kemp a little later in the show on this topic of private school vouchers, but let me just tick through a couple other topics that he had thoughts on. And the first is Rivian. Rivian is, of course, the electric vehicle maker. They announced they are pausing construction on a $5 billion plant east of Atlanta. And Kemp said that Rivian CEO called him a few days before the decision was announced publicly. And here's what Kemp had to say.
For us, it's disappointing. I mean, we were looking forward to them going vertical and building the first R2 here. Everything they're telling us, they're still committed. They can still meet the metrics that they have to under our contract obligations by 2030, I think it is. We honor our commitments in our state, and we're going to do that in regards to the site, and we're expecting the company to honor their commitments as well.
And Raul, this is a big deal for Kemp, who has really made a point of saying his goal is to make Georgia the electric mobility capital of the world. Also, another topic, our colleague at the Georgia Recorder, Jill Nolan, asked Kemp about efforts that fizzled this year to fully expand Medicaid in Georgia, as our state is among the dwindling handful of holdouts at this point. And Kemp basically said, no love lost. It wasn't something he really wanted in the first place.
Well, let me just say, you know, there wasn't any kibosh by me on Medicaid expansion. It was never my idea to even discuss that. That was a legislative priority, mainly of the House, to put that out there and have some conversations.
And just another quick note on the topic of healthcare before we move on. As we're taping this podcast, the Senate is voting on a bill to reform Certificate of Need. These are basically hospital regulations that Democrats had hoped might be part of some big grand compromise deal to fully expand Medicaid this year. And it appears that that is not going to be happening. CON moving forward, Medicaid expansion, not.
And again, Sam, you know, for a press conference that was called on 1 hour notice, that made a lot of news. And as you said, we'll talk more about what the governor had to say about school vouchers in our next segment with education reporter Juma Say. I do want to mention something else that happened Tuesday, and it was the first major hearing on the House side dealing with the expansion of sports betting in Georgia. This specifically was a hearing on Senate Bill 386, which legalizes sports betting in Georgia after being approved by voters in a statewide referendum. Now, there is a separate piece of legislation, Senate Resolution 579. That's the actual voter referendum that would change Georgia's constitution when it comes to gambling. Here's some of the key numbers for our audience to know. There would be 16 licensees, 9 of them that would be already assigned. You know, like, for example, Atlanta's professional sports team. 7 would be given through a bidding process. The sports betting company revenues would be taxed at 20%. The new revenues that would head to the state would mainly go to pre-K, then the Hope Scholarship, along with a gambling addiction fund and a fund to promote and attract major sporting events. So I want to take our audience inside Tuesday's hearing and really inside this debate on legalizing sports betting and gambling overall. Here's a sample of some of the things that lawmakers brought up, changes, ideas, and here are the lawmakers you're going to hear from. State Representatives Amani Barnes, Matt Dubnik, Casey Carpenter, and Sam Park.
Would you consider putting an amendment to direct some of the funds to free school lunch for the students in the state?
I had a number of folks ask me this morning, what does this bill do to either encourage or prevent fantasy sports and fantasy sports companies?
And then just a suggestion on, and I know this is probably going to ruffle some feathers, but if you want to address problem gambling, there may be some limits as to how many wages you allow someone to do.
The Senate version of this bill states that there's a 20% tax, whereas if I recall, the House version had a 25% tax.
That's correct.
So is there a willingness to increase that back up to 25% for the House version?
Yeah, that's why I'm over here in the House. Y'all do a great job at help perfecting our Senate bill, so I'd be open to discuss that with you.
Now, the last voice you heard there was Republican State Senator Clint Dixon. He is the author of Senate Bill 386. Sam, I'm going to be keeping an eye on as this bill moves through and tries to track to get onto the House floor. Now, Sam, let's switch to a topic that you have been covering for us for a long time, not just this session, but previous sessions, and that's efforts by Republican lawmakers to restrict gender-affirming care for minors. This week, a Georgia Senate committee advanced a ban on puberty-blocking medication for minors seeking gender-affirming care. Sam, what's going on here?
So let me just explain what it is that we're talking about here. Puberty blockers pause puberty, and that's typically a first step for young people experiencing gender dysphoria who are seeking some medical treatment so that they can better align their bodies with their gender identity. Now, Republicans did not go this far in last year's very controversial legislation, but now they have inserted a ban on puberty blockers into another bill, HB 1170, on a totally different topic. HB 1170 requires some government buildings, courthouses, and universities to stock the opioid overdose reversal medication naloxone. Now that bill would also include this language on banning puberty blockers for young people.
And again, Sam, we've talked about this in previous shows. Example of lawmakers using another bill as a vehicle to push through last-minute legislation that did not clear over crossover. Like you said, this bill originally dealt with Narcan.
Exactly. Democrats had no idea this was coming, and all the testimony at the hearing was people who wanted to see puberty blockers banned. No one else in the medical community knew to even come testify about this bill. Now, Republicans say they're pursuing this, pointing to side effects from these medications, but Democrats and LGBTQ allies warn that these drugs can be life-saving for transgender youth. The measure still needs to clear the full Senate and the House, so it's unclear what its future is by the end of this session, but it is certainly something to watch.
Okay, one last thing. I know we've said that. One last thing. We've traveled to Ohio, the campaign trail here in Georgia, the state capital. Let's make one final stop, the Fulton County Courthouse. Judge Scott McAfee quashing 6 counts from the indictment handed up in the Georgia election interference case. First of all, Sam, how big of a deal is this?
Well, 6 counts are a big deal, but just to put that in some context, there are still 35 counts remaining, including that racketeering charge. Former President Donald Trump, now instead of facing 13 felony counts in Georgia, he is facing 10. Now let's talk about these 6 counts in question. All of them have to do with charges that defendants solicited public officials to violate their oaths. And what Judge McAfee said is that prosecutors weren't specific enough about exactly how these officials would have violated their oaths to the Constitution of Georgia and the U.S. had they gone along with former President Trump and his allies. And without those specifics, Judge McAfee said the defense wouldn't be able to adequately prepare their defense in court.
So, Sam, you mentioned those 6 counts having to do with soliciting public officials to violate their oaths. Does that include that infamous phone call between then President Donald Trump and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger?
Yeah, it does reference that call and also activities like state legislative testimony when Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani tried to convince lawmakers to go along with their plans to interfere with the election result. But Raul, here's where this gets nuanced. McAfee is throwing out specific counts, specific crimes like solicitation of public officials, but not other ones like false statements or racketeering that are also connected to that phone call or that legislative testimony. So these incidents, this evidence will still play a central role in the case. Now, how about these 6 counts? Are they gone for good? Prosecutors can appeal this ruling, but they can also just go back to a grand jury and indict again with more specifics about basically the constitutional theory underlying the charges. I talked to one former prosecutor who said doing that might not actually be necessary. He might just let these charges go, especially in a case with so many charges still remaining on the books. But Georgia State University law professor Anthony Michael Kreis says there is one reason Willis might want to fight for these counts.
I think Fani Willis was really trying to tap into a theme that what Donald Trump and his allies were allegedly trying to do here in Georgia was upend the constitutional order and violate the heart of our democracy. And so these charges spoke to that in a way that some of these other ones don't. And so I think she'll probably be loath to let this go.
Sam, you and I really cover 4 of the most interesting city blocks in Georgia, if not the whole country. If you're walking down Mitchell Street, on the right, you've got the Georgia State Capitol. On the next block, you have Atlanta City Hall. On the next block, you have the Fulton County Courthouse. And on that 4th block, you have the Fulton County Government Center. It's just, it's crazy that all of these stories are happening just a few buildings from each other. For now, let's take a break, maybe go take a walk. This is Gold Dome Scramble from WABE.
Support for WABE comes from Capital Good Fund, introducing Georgia Bright Solar Lease Program, a new rooftop solar initiative designed to create pathways to equitable and inclusive solar, sustainability, and monthly savings for Georgians. Learn more at georgiabright.org.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Welcome back to Gold Dome Scramble. We're going to dig into some breaking news from the legislature. Republicans' latest attempt to create a private school vouchers program cleared the House after failing there last year.
Sam, one of the great things about this year's episodes of Gold Dome Scramble has been all the new WABE reporters we've been able to welcome on board, and we have the perfect guest to tackle today's news, WABE education reporter Juma Say. Juma, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Also, I'm a Muslim. I'm fasting right now, and I just want to say Ramadan Mubarak to all the folks that are listening who also might be fasting or who are listening, since they've broken their fast. Just had to say that at the top.
Well, as we Jews say in Passover, I hope you're having an easy fast.
Thank you.
Before we get into it, I would like to hear, Juma, a little bit about how you got here to us at WABE.
Yeah, okay. So basically, I applied for a fellowship coming out of college because I knew that I really liked to storytell. I knew that I liked to write, and I wanted to figure out a way to do that in the real world. I was lucky enough to land that fellowship, and I actually Sam, from your went to your alma mater, NPR, for a little bit of time. So I was in DC for a year doing a kind of rotational fellowship. And then as that was winding down, I was like, okay, I need to find like a real job, something that will sort of sustain an existence and a career sort of beyond that. I started looking at other things about halfway through the fellowship. I had applied to a production gig that didn't end up working out. And the evening that I got rejected from that, I just literally searched up public media jobs on Google, and found this gig as an education reporter. And it stood out to me for a number of reasons. Education has always been a huge passion of mine. I'm a big tutoring, mentoring kind of person. So it was in my sort of topic and beat of interest. My brother is also a senior at Emory. So I knew that, a gig opening up at WABE meant that I could live in the same place as my brother for the first time in 6 years. So I was like, all right, I have to, get my P's and Q's together so I can, do well in these interviews and all that kind of stuff. And I'm lucky enough that it worked out.
Sam, on last week's show, you mentioned that at times I literally live at the Georgia State Capitol. Well, I've got bad news. Juma has the bug at the Capitol as well.
Yeah, I will say I have the bug. And this is something we talked about a little bit before the show, but there's, I think, a number of reasons that I like reporting at the Capitol. I think the first is just sort of a very simple sort of childlike wonder at being in a capital of a United States state. It's wild. It's folks walking around in suits. It's fancy things going on. It's meetings happening. It feels like the kind of journalism that you see in movies and TV, which is just super exciting. I should also say, though, that it feels very alien and dystopian to me to be walking around in this space that holds so much weight and so much power. And I think that is something that is not lost on me at all while I'm at the Capitol. But as I think of sort of how I want to build out my beat here in Atlanta, I think it's important to have Capitol reporting as a fundamental sort of element of what I'm offering, just as I also prioritize being in schools and being in classrooms and being in teachers. I also think it's important to be in the sort of rooms and in the meetings where you see the sort of minutia of how ideas become law, so that I'm able to better articulate how that law then impacts real folks. The last thing I'll also say is just there's not a lot of folks at the Capitol that look like me. I'm a dark-skinned black man with, dreadlocks in my hair. And I think it's just super important for me to sort of take up space and sort of quite literally by my presence help this building look different. And then also just be, a younger, more diverse member of the press corps and sort of bring a context and a positionality that is often overlooked in sort of journalistic kind of spaces, just because there aren't a lot of folks that look like us out here. So, yeah.
On that last point, I really want to agree with you, Juma, because over the past few years, we've seen the press corps diversify, more Asians, more black reporters, more reporters from outside of Atlanta, and it has been great to see at the state capitol.
One of the biggest topics of debate in the legislature has to do with funding for schools, and it has to do with using public funding to provide for some subsidies for kids in select schools to go to private schools. Juma, can you talk a little bit about what this actually means when we say school voucher program?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the school vouchers bill, we're talking about Senate Bill 233. And what essentially does is it establishes the Georgia Promise Scholarship. And that will be sort of like a pool of money that a parent can tap into, where you can get basically like a $6,500 sort of grant to offer for your child some sort of non-traditional education. And by that, for real, what we're talking about is taking your kid out of public school and sending them to a private school or homeschooling them. And I should clarify that you are only eligible for this sort of voucher program if you attend a school or if you have a child who attends a school that's in the bottom 25% of our performance in public school or for public schools here in Georgia. This is not just something that's happening in this state. It's also been passed and implemented in Arizona, in Florida. So it's really sort of part of a sort of national trend of vouchers bills. Sometimes you also hear them called sort of school savings accounts. But yes, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the vouchers bill.
So let's talk about language for a moment. You know, advocates call themselves pro-choice or pro-life, but these aren't terms that we use as journalists because they have connotations or framing that are meant to go along with them. And I want to talk about language in the context of this bill. School choice is often the framing of conservative backers. Vouchers is something maybe we hear from opponents more often. Talk to me about the ways in which the words we use to describe these programs shape the debate.
Yeah, so I should say that, this has been something I've been trying to understand myself as I make sense of this bill and really try to register why the, school choice bill, the school voucher bill is just the thing. I don't think there's any other way to describe it. And I think when we're talking about choice, I think it is important to situate vouchers and this debate along with all the other sort of parents' choice kinds of debates going on nationally right now. When we're talking about choice, we mean a parent's right to choose what their kids learn in school, what their kids have in their libraries. There is this larger wave that is kind of sitting on this bedrock of parents' choice, parents' rights. So that is what we mean when we're using this kind of language for a bill like this. And it's something that comes up in debates all the time. When proponents of the vouchers bill will discuss why they support it, one of the first things they'll say is, I support choice, or I'm pro a parent's right to choose where their child goes to school.
So I want to talk about the moment the vote happened after all of the passionate debate. You know, you can watch a lot of things streaming, hearings, and what's going on the floor. But there are certain moments that when you're there, you won't forget them. I want to go back a year when this legislation failed in the House. And when the vote actually happened, I wasn't in the House. I was in the Senate. Sam was in the House. And you could hear the reaction when it failed by just a handful of votes. You could hear that sound come across the Capitol. I actually even tweeted about it. Juma, let's fast forward to today and the moment that this passed by one vote. You need 91 votes to pass something in the Georgia House. It got 91 votes. Take us to that moment.
Yeah, so I should say, there was an air about the Capitol all day today. From the second I walked out of my car, you could just tell that something was in the water, right? And I think that's something that I kind of felt entering the press box. It's something that I felt watching the vote happen. And just to sort of add to the drama, the vouchers bill came up a lot earlier than folks were expecting. I had asked some folks, when is it going to be on the floor for vote? They said after lunch. I was like, okay, means I got time to write my story, yada, yada, yada. And then sort of after a couple morning order things, they said that they were going to move on to the rules calendar. For listeners, the rules calendar is where they vote on these kinds of things. And, it seemed like 5 minutes later, we were then hearing debate about the vouchers bill. And sort of when you have this kind of debate, you have the folks that are pro-vouchers saying that, they want to support a parent's right to choose where their child goes to school. You have the people that are anti-vouchers saying that, this is in offering this money to parents to send their kids to private schools or homeschool them, you're taking away sort of money from public schools. You have this tension that's just building and building and building as folks on either side are kind of making their argument, and it all sort of culminates in this climax of the vote, and it was insane. It was dozens of representatives on the House floor, sort of all kind of scurrying to their seats, locking in their votes. And then immediately subsequent that, you have everyone looking up at the big screen to see, are they going to hit that 91? You had us all in the press box, like looking at the screen to see, are they going to hit that 91? And then the second that the vote kind of finally populated on the screen, there was just this like weird air that set in that was like a mix of like surprise and what seemed like for some anxiety, obviously what was for others excitement. So that is what this moment was. It felt like, a 2 hour span of my day. But just again, to flag for listeners, like this vouchers bill has been something that folks have been telling me about since I got to Georgia, since I got to WAB and since I started this job. So in a lot of ways, it felt like I was like preparing to cover this right now, right here. And I will say that like, my heart is still beating like a jackrabbit from just the amount of like tension in the room.
Juma, this week we heard from Governor Brian Kemp, who told reporters that he really wanted to get this bill done. Let's take a listen.
There are no more next years. It's my hope that we'll get that done this year. And yes, we will be aggressively pushing for that once we know what the House's posture is going to be.
So, Juma, talk to me a little bit about some of the changes that were made to this bill to make it a bit more palatable for maybe some of the more rural Republicans who had voted no when it came up for a House vote last year.
Yeah, definitely. So before I get into that, I should just flag for listeners that the reason sort of more rural Republicans were against this bill from jump is because, you had folks in communities where there wasn't a whole bunch of private schools saying like 6,500, is great, but like this obviously benefits folks in metro centers a lot more than it does us. Nevertheless, to sort of frame how this bill has changed since last year, there were a number of things that they added to just sort of make it more enticing. One, they sort of codified all of the various teacher pay raises that Governor Kemp has rolled out since about like 2019 into the bill. My understanding is that these pay raises are, it's not like if this voucher bill had failed, teachers would not have gotten this money. More so what it's just doing is sort of like writing it into law. So there was that. There was also a sort of a study committee from, I believe it was the House of Representatives, that had a number of suggestions earlier this year for how to improve pre-K in the state. One of their suggestions was, to make funds available for pre-Ks to sort of develop current infrastructure, and then also for, other pre-Ks to sort of start up and sort of build classrooms and things like that. That was also wrapped into the bill. There was also an inter-district sort of transfer policy. I feel like the minutia of it is sometimes it feels like it went over my head, so I'm not going to get into all that. But that was also something else that was wrapped into this bill as a way to make it more enticing. And I should say that last point, the like inter-district transfer policy, that had been floated earlier this session in a number of other bills, but including one by Representative Tyler Paul Smith. And I should note that Tyler Paul Smith, he's the rural Republican. He was one of the folks last year who voted against this bill because of the argument that I had mentioned earlier, that, it doesn't really benefit his community, in the same way as it would someone in a metro community, because there aren't really private schools sort of in rural communities in as large of numbers. Not only was sort of the legislation that he considered earlier this session roped into the vouchers bill, he was also a Republican that sort of switched votes. So he voted in favor of the bill this year where he had voted against it last year. And I think that is evidence of the ways that these changes and these new additions sort of added more fodder to just make it more of or make it an easier sell for particularly the Republicans who were kind of against it. So yeah, that's just some of how this bill has changed since last year. But the core of it is still the same. It's this sort of extra money for students who attend public schools in the bottom 25% to, alternately attend a private school with this voucher money or be homeschooled and then have their parents use this voucher money to sort of help fund that.
That brings us to the debate today on the floor. Take us there, Juma.
Yeah, okay. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the debate happened kind of earlier than folks were expecting, happened before lunch. And another thing that I should say is it kind of felt like Groundhog Day. Now, I wasn't reporting at the Capitol last year when the vouchers bill was heard, but the part of the reason I knew that it felt like a moment in which history was almost repeating itself is because lawmakers literally said this. One of the things that Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones said just as she started her testimony is that it felt like Groundhog Day at the Capitol. And her testimony was interesting because basically what she started by doing was sort of cataloging all the different instances in which money from the state already sort of goes to sort of funding private education in one way or another, whether this is kids that go to public schools and are dual enrolled in a private school. This means like a kid that is, going to a high school, but then is also taking math classes at like Morehouse, for example, that and just sort of other things. So just trying to frame what it seemed like to me was she was trying to, from jump, sort of undercut the opposition's primary argument that the reason that vouchers aren't necessarily that great of a thing is because you're taking public funds to support private education. Another person who sort of had sort of big picture framing of why this voucher, or in support of this vouchers bill, was Representative Scott Hilton. Here's what he had to say.
I've never had a constituent come to me and say, Scott, you know what? I've got too many choices in education. I wish you'd please pare them back.
One of the things that Hilton emphasizes that I think, again, goes back to the conversation that we were having a little earlier is this idea of choice, right? Of, this vouchers program is a way to offer for parents, for families, just more options. One of the reasons that folks argue that the vouchers bill defunds public education is because headcount is used in the formula for how schools are funded. So if a district loses a student because of this vouchers program, if someone leaves Atlanta Public Schools or leaves Fulton County Public Schools to go to a private school, that means less money coming into the district's pocket because, again, there's money that is tied to that student. Another thing that opponents of the vouchers bill sort of emphasized was all the different additions that were made to sweeten up the deal. Here's what Representative Miriam Parris had to say.
It is still a pig with lipstick. It is a pig with lipstick, mascara, foundation, blush, and all of the rest.
One thing that I should say is that when Miriam Parris mentioned this thing about a pig with lipstick, it did kind of get a chuckle from everyone. But I think the point that she was trying to make was clearly driven home that this is the same bill from last year, just with additions to kind of sweeten up the deal and help it get over the line, which it ultimately did.
So as Juma mentioned, you had the House add a number of things to this Senate bill, and that means Senate Bill 233 is going to have to go back to the Senate for another vote. Now, there are plenty of other education bills we want to talk about. So Juma, let's get to it. Let's talk about some of the other bills that you have been following at the state capitol.
Yeah, so there's just a bunch of bills to follow because Georgia's a state where education sort of is just there's a lot of interest at the Capitol is the way that I'll put it. But there were a series of controversial bills that I was reporting on that kind of dominated my life for a couple weeks. And I'm just going to run through them really quickly, just to kind of frame really the magnitude of the kind of legislation that we were talking about. There was Senate Bill 88, which would have banned private school teachers from discussing gender in the classroom. There was Senate Bill 154, which would have allowed school librarians to be criminally prosecuted for distributing material deemed, quote, harmful to minors as currently defined in Georgia law. There was Senate Bill 365, which would have given parents more insight into the kind of stuff their kids are checking out from school libraries. And there was Senate Bill 394, which would have created a new restricted category for school materials with, quote, sexually explicit content deemed harmful to minors. All four of those bills that I just mentioned, I'll put it this way, like those were all days like today at the Capitol, right? Days where you walk into the committee meeting and it's hard to find a seat because there are so many people there sort of wanting to testify in favor and against, just sort of they brought up a lot of attention. And yet all 4 of those bills didn't make it past crossover day. The last thing that I'll say is while those 4 didn't make it past crossover day, there was one controversial sort of library restriction that did. That's Senate Bill 390, which would essentially cut ties between the American Library Association and public and school libraries here in Georgia. That we are sort of waiting to see when that'll come up and up for a vote in the House of Representatives. But that, again, is just sort of the sort of last man standing from this crop of legislation, sort of culture war-y, controversial-y kind of legislation that was floated at the Capitol for what seemed like sort of weeks on end.
So as Raul wants us to remind our audience, it is possible that some of these bills could come back. They can be inserted into the text of another bill that did meet the deadline. So never say never. But Juma, the thing I want to ask you is this. I wonder if you see a common thread between all of these bills that you've just mentioned. I think, this focus on parents and the relationship between parents and kids and schools is something that comes up so often now in the State House, and they're always among the most controversial bills that get discussed in a given session. Why do you think that these are cropping up so much in this particular moment?
Yeah. So I can't necessarily speak to sort of why they're cropping up right here, right now, just because, I'm not one of the bill sponsors. But I will say that a through line that connects all of them is the way they sort of implicate LGBTQ folks in one way or another. And this is a big part of the sort of argument from folks who were against these bills. They said that all this language about harmful to minors, all this language about sexually explicit content sort of disproportionately impact books, material that had themes that sort of implicated LGBTQ stories and LGBTQ narratives. And I should add that, to zoom even further back, this is not just something that's happening in Georgia, this kind of legislation. This is legislation that we've seen in other states, like mostly our neighbor to the south, Florida. But that is sort of the big picture framing of all this controversial stuff, is it seemed to be part of what I called in one story a seemingly sort of anti-LGBTQ riptide, according to folks who were against these bills.
Now, Juma, I think you told us this morning that you're obsessed with covering the topic of literacy. It's something that seems like it could be a bit wonky, especially for people who are not educators or don't have school-age children. So talk to me a little bit about why we should care so much about this particular topic.
Yeah, Sam, I am obsessed with literacy. My friends all know this. I'll just start by saying that, reading is the foundation to, everything you do. Everything you do, the way you communicate, the way you live this life, everything, how you interact in society. And I think that the reason literacy has become such a sort of hot button issue in Georgia in particular is because of, one, a universal recognition of that reality, that sort of reading is the bedrock to just human existence, at least in this state. And also just sort of a really unfortunate look at the state's reading scores. To give listeners some context, according to the 2022-2023 statewide Georgia Milestones testing, it's one of the flagship standardized tests that students take, only 39% of Georgia third graders were proficient or above in English language arts. And the reason we're talking about third grade scores in particular is because that's a year that's colloquially known as the year where a student goes from learning to read to reading to learn, right? That's where you transition sort of just putting the basics together for being able to make it through a chapter book to then actually understanding and sort of digesting the material in a way that can sort of propel your education moving forward. And again, with only about 40% of students reading proficiently, it's just striking, I'll put it that way. And that's something that the legislature has recognized. Last year, they passed House Bill 538. And what that does is it creates this sort of sweeping overhaul of the way that you teach students to read in Georgia. But yeah, so that's why this whole literacy is become a thing, is the recognition of one, how much Georgia is struggling, two, how important literacy is just to society, and then three, all of that talk has been backed by legislation now.
Juma, everything you're talking about is something I'm living as my younger son is a third grader, and you watch that transition. So, As I've said in this show, and I actually have said in a lot of shows, I'm a budget geek. And one thing I like when I go through the budget or see budget changes is to look at the little things, minor things. And in this year's budget, when the House brought their changes to the 2025 budget, I noticed this little line, $6.3 million. And again, that sounds like a lot of money, but in a budget that's $36 billion, it's a small line, but it had to do with school nutrition and a story you had already been following, Juma.
Yeah. So folks might have been familiar with the whole Decatur lunches hullabaloo from about a month and a half ago. Essentially, there was this story that came out emphasizing that because some students didn't have sufficient funds in their account, instead of getting the sort of lasagna or pizza or whatever the typical hot meal was, they alternately would get a cheese sandwich and some milk, right? And it became this whole thing. And as I was looking into it, I found out that, though there was a lot of outcry and outburst at this sort of proposed Decatur policy, Decatur was not the only school district that floated something like that. There are other school districts that have very similar policies in place, whether it is a cheese sandwich, whether it's a peanut butter and jelly. But basically, the essence of it is, because you cannot pay for lunch, you get some sort of alternative in order to sort of save the school from incurring a bunch of debt, because they're footing the cost of these sort of lunches. Now, the $6.3 million line item in the budget is trying to sort of address that. It's something that was really the reason we really see that line item is because of the work from Representative Imani Barnes. And she's been on this wave since before the whole Decatur situation. Last year, she sponsored a bill that was trying to get free and reduced lunch sort of paid for all students in Georgia, all students that qualify for free and reduced lunch, that is. She didn't get the bill passed, but the money was appropriated. And for those who don't know what the word appropriated is, that was me a couple months ago. It just means she got the money for it. Similar thing this year. She sponsored the bill again to get this sort of school lunch debt addressed through legislation. The bill failed, but she got the money. So the $6.3 million is to go towards fully covering and fully funding lunch costs for all students who qualify for free lunch or for a federally reduced lunch.
Juma, thanks for joining us on what has been an incredibly busy day and a busy week for you. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Raul. I appreciate it. And thank you, Sam, for having me.
Thanks, Juma. And with that, we'll have to leave it there. Gold Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers, and our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
You can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast, and check out WABE.org/Under the Gold Dome. We'll see you next week.
Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast, as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at WABE.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
Sounds Like ATL is a music documentary series that takes an in-depth look at the artists amplifying Atlanta's famed music community. Built around a desire to highlight Atlanta's diverse and world-renowned music scene, each episode features unforgettable, intimate musical performances by fresh new musical guests, each with exclusive interviews about the stories behind their music. Listen at WABE.org or wherever you find your podcasts.